Ladies and gentlemen,
and now for something completely different.
As these things become increasingly more obvious, it becomes harder to choose where to start telling the entire story, where to truly begin, or from which specific key signature to start from. And so after a few days of reconsidering, a few days of wondering whether to wrap up this story, for example, as a useful past, and for the sake of greater efficiency, it's best to do it like this. And the various events that have unfolded during the intervening period, including the most recent ones, I truly hope will serve to further validate and confirm this specific interpretation. So, where exactly have we arrived at this point? Who is the winner? Who is the winner? Who recognizes the victory? Who does not recognize the victory? We have come to delicate questions. I am not the one in charge, and it's a good thing I'm not, to judge who are the fools, who are the scoundrels, and what constitutes victory. I believe it is essential to allow every single person to judge the situation for themselves, and in the complex process of defining exactly what constitutes a true victory and who the ultimate winner is, as well as identifying those who have unfortunately not emerged as winners, I think this can, to be completely honest, provide the most significant and meaningful assistance to everyone involved. Because the key question of the ultimate nature of victory, to go back to that evolution, to return to the famous philosophical concept of Plato's allegory of the cave, so to speak, the key question, as we have previously said, is actually the fundamental question of who actually controls, or even more precisely, who creates the entire digital and physical infrastructure. Who is the winner? Well, the winner is the one who managed to move someone from point A to point B. Whether they are satisfied or not with the point they've reached, the journey, the service, and so on, that's their problem. What matters is whether someone managed to move, let's say, the whole flock, if you want to look at it that way, from point A to point B. And that's the whole story. That's the whole story. Or, of course, you can have that interpretation that everything happens by chance and that things just, spontaneously, yes, that's the world of freedom. It's very important. We have to go back. Don't forget that all of this is happening within the layers of that so-called free world, officially that's right, of freedom, democracy, and where everyone supposedly has a say. That's how it is. So, from this perspective, you continue to increase the penalties further. We actually come to the key question, and that is the question of infrastructure. When I say infrastructure, look at the entire structure of all the systems. Not just who built that railway or who made the locomotive and that wagon and so on, and then filled it with what it needs to have, hired conductors, ticket inspectors, and so on. No, look at it as all possible systems you can think of. See it as infrastructure. Everything is a matter of infrastructure. And infrastructure is a great thing, meaning infrastructure itself is not to blame for anything. The question of infrastructure is that various systems have been built, exist, are being built, and will be built, each with different purposes. And when we talk about infrastructure, let me emphasize once again, whatever comes to mind, informational infrastructure, educational infrastructure, you need to start from it, monetary systems, exchange systems. Of course, first and foremost, international ones with all the implications for any local system. Distribution. All the systems you can think of, I won't list them all, just think of any. And all of that is infrastructure. And luckily that's good, the infrastructure is excellent. However, if we're talking about infrastructure, there is a key question, and this is where the best of all possible worlds begins for every language, because infrastructure by itself allows someone else to solve a part of the problem that is actually your problem as well, someone else. Imagine if there were no infrastructure, how long it would take you to travel from point A to point B if there was no infrastructure. For example, how you would make a payment, how you would take a trip, how you would get to an airport. Imagine if you had to go all the way to China yourself to get what you need, and so on. And on top of that, how would you let them know what you need so that it's waiting for you? Or you'll have to wait there when you go to get it made, or somewhere else. It's a matter of infrastructure. And now when it comes to infrastructure, this is a trap. This is a trap, a historical one. There's nothing new about it. First of all, that's why, as we said, from which low point we started, even a good part of this show will resemble a correction of the past. All for the sake of the future, of course. The issue of infrastructure is crucial, because if we're talking about infrastructure, any kind, anything at all, of course, the quality of that infrastructure is in question. When I say quality, I mean the reach, the scope, the quality of the structure, how reliable it is, how safe it is, what it accomplishes, at what cost it is completed, and of course these are all important parameters, how it develops. And we're talking about a world in which global infrastructure has existed for centuries. In fact, in many respects, it has existed for millennia and continues to develop. And although it's difficult to talk about global infrastructure for various periods in history, precisely because of technological development, it existed even then, but from the perspective of what people today consider infrastructure, it would be hard to classify it as such, even though someone tried to do the same job. And all credit to them for that. Some people try to do it, and some actually do. And it's fortunate the problem isn't with them. The problem lies with those others who get used to someone else always doing everything, and not only that, but they even forget that someone else did it all. Which actually brings us back to the key question of infrastructure. Much more important than that is how high quality it is, how reliable, how far-reaching, and so on. And the key question of infrastructure is actually the question of whose it is, which also perhaps raises the fundamental and complex question of jurisdiction, which ultimately leads us directly to the most important question of all. You already know exactly which one I'm about to say. I don't even know why I'm going back to the very beginning, the essential question of sovereignty. Because infrastructure, foundational infrastructure, is a dangerous and subtle trap. This is actually the inherent trap of every best possible world, not just the five-letter one, and that is when you become or accept some foundational infrastructure and become an integrated part of some broader infrastructure, a payment system, a global monetary system, or any kind of technical infrastructure, when you become part of something much bigger and broader, use whatever word or mental image you find most appropriate for infrastructure, you gain many more possibilities. You get many more opportunities to reach out, to finish your goals, to conclude things much faster or with significantly better quality. You have a much greater choice, yes. However, the reality is that you simultaneously become a much less important part of that vast infrastructure, of that entire system. Especially, and I want to emphasize this, if in fact you have no authority within that infrastructure. As they say, you become less important or not important at all, you're just useful. Of course, now we have to return to the concept of the best of all possible worlds and why it is necessary for someone, not just in this case, but in many cases before, to constantly explain and convince a person, and people in general, that they matter, that their opinions are valued, and that, at least to a significant extent, if nothing else, in the marketing and advertising of a system, and objectively, even during the actual functioning of certain systems, real attention is paid, not just nominally, not just rhetorically, to making it seem as though someone's opinion matters there, including yours. However, we come to the key question. Can someone, for some reason, take away your right to have a say? Can someone do something regarding infrastructure without your knowledge? And in fact, who are these people? And especially from the perspective of what it means if you are not the one. Let's go back to why this picture is here. I suggest everyone look at it from the perspective of the monetary system. When we talk about the monetary system, don't look at this as just some pieces of paper, coins or whatever. Always view it from the perspective that someone is controlling on the other side of the equation, the nominal part, which when needed, and as much as needed, is used to express something that exists in reality. For example, in that nominal part, someone or some people can just throw up their hands and inject several trillion of something into the system. Can you inject several trillion of something into the system, for example? Now apply these to any system. This is the question, how much authority someone has. That's where you see it best. Just as you can count it out with other questions as well, including whether you decide, for example, when the train, ship or plane departs, or if someone else has decided when it leaves. And will they wait for you if you're late or decide to go at a different time? What will happen then? Or maybe they'll charge you extra for that, like a special charter flight. And the question of authority actually defines the key issue of infrastructure. The question of authority, how important you are within the system, is the key question. How deeply important is the surrounding infrastructure to you personally? And conversely, how truly important are you to that very same infrastructure? And that is the fundamental key to understanding this dynamic, because if you choose to set up part of some complex infrastructure or some vast system over which you have absolutely no direct influence, then, to put it quite mildly, the closest possible analogy is that you must never lose sight of the critical fact that it is simply not your own system and that it is not your personal infrastructure. The best possible way to look at such an external infrastructure or system, take a moment to think of the right word for this specific image, is to see it as if you are cautiously going deep into the dark woods, especially if those woods are not yours to claim. So, if it's not yours, if it's not infrastructure where you are sure that you have a say, or at least know who does, and that it's someone you can influence, then in a way, with that transfer of sovereignty, the issue of infrastructure is really like going into the woods. One that isn't yours. And people often go into the woods for various reasons. Let's not go into all of them now. Whether out of necessity, by choice, or according to plan, but they don't stay to live there. Supposedly. Well, you decide now, right? That's exactly how you should treat someone else's infrastructure. Any kind. Whether it's informational, monetary, commercial, legal, and so on, when it comes to any system that belongs to someone else. This question of what belongs to others, and this word others, now again sounds a bit provincial from the perspective of that free, whole, and so on, world marketplace. We need to drop by into the design. However, that is the absolutely fundamental and critical point to consider. The specific mindset and general attitude one adopts regarding infrastructure, and more precisely, the complex way in which we interact with and relate to infrastructure or systems that are not yours, but you use them every single day. The reason for the existence of the whole world. Now, what is the best of all possible worlds is the one where someone else creates everything. And that is exactly what is now fully unfolding, and that's why I said I don't even know where to begin to talk about it. For decades now, and especially these days and these months, it is precisely this question of perception and experience. How much is something truly yours? Does the mere fact that you are part of something, that you use something, actually prove and confirm that it is yours? Or, heaven forbid, does it actually only show and confirm that you belong to them, to him, or use whichever word you find most appropriate here, to some system or some infrastructure? In short, who belongs to whom, which of course you define in the next step, and for whose benefit or perhaps whose exploitation. It all comes down to the question of who owns the infrastructure. You or someone of yours. When I say yours, I mean your community, which also brings us back to that crucial point of defining what is a community and what is not a community, or actually maybe it already belongs to someone else, maybe someone who is hiding, and we add that up until the very end of the project. And here the question of infrastructure is actually the element that defines things best. And the question of who is the winner, or more precisely, who will win, and who are the defeated. Don't forget, no matter how it sounds, maybe it doesn't seem nice, but in the end it's also sporting. For someone to win, someone else has to lose, which now depends on how much it fits into that concept of being free, equal, and so on, all of that. And the key question is, how aware is each person of where they are and what situation they're in? And that's the whole story. So the fundamental question we need to address here is about the actual ownership and control of this critical infrastructure. Is it anyone in particular, or is it perhaps everyone collectively? We must ask, who is the primary owner, who exactly are the various owners involved, and what is the specific nature of your professional relationship with them? How much and in what way do you influence? How much and in what way can you influence or can't influence? Of course, then comes the question of price, quality, volume, stability, security, and so on. However, no matter how important any of these questions are, the key question is, whose infrastructure is it? Who are the owners and who are the users? And of course, to cover all possibilities, the owners and users can be the same, or they can be different. And now, whichever system, whichever infrastructure you think of, consider precisely these questions in relation to the truth, or more precisely, in relation to the truth. And that's where all the answers are hidden. One of the first shows, a long, long time ago, I think it was even the very first show in the format of Radio Democracy, we talked about it, and I regret that we haven't returned to this topic more often, but now we will, yes, now we will, as part of the School of the Soviet Republic, we will cover all of this, along with everything else, especially now considering the events that best describe it. And we will also look at things through this treble clef perspective. We have previously discussed in detail how, for example, when describing the gradual development and the complex evolution of the system of exploitation of the world, you can refer to it by whatever name you prefer, the infrastructure, that in fact, the experience that is considered to be less useful, which is of very high quality, is sometimes even less qualitative in its nature. In my opinion, it describes best of all possible worlds, including the one created with the Organization of the United Nations. The complex and multifaceted experience of India's development, and not just any version of India, but specifically India as that structured organizational format, which was originally created under the rule of Great Britain, or more precisely, under the powerful commercial entity known as the British East India Company, which laid the groundwork for the modern state. And we mentioned, you talked about in that evolution, the emergence of something that is predominantly called the Indian Raj, or Raj, however it's pronounced, which was actually a concept of governance over the subcontinent, much broader than India, both past and present, both, and in fact, through the concept of diarchy. And diarchy, as the word itself says, means dual rule, but not absence of rule. Rather, dual rule in the sense that the levels of authority are divided, and that somewhere there is a sovereign who has a say over certain matters, while, for example, somewhere else there is a certain sovereignty over specific issues, or up to a certain extent. And as is developed for almost 200 years, someone was playing, for example, with all of them over there in that part of the world, which is roughly a third or a quarter of the world's population, and not just with them over there. Let me point out right away, but for the sake of this example's perspective, and then someone realized they could play with the whole world. That's how it is. And no matter how much they talk about a world of absolute freedom, a world of total equality, about a world of modern infrastructure, universal access to that infrastructure, and universal human rights, to use their own terminology once again, did you somehow forget all of this? Or have you simply chosen to ignore the reality of the situation? However it may develop, essentially it is an extension of the story of diarrhea that evolved during something that is often, among other things, called, under many names, corporate imperialism. It might even sound familiar, considering the many things they use to scare people about what might happen. However, let me also remind you, perhaps this will be a useful lesson from the past for knowledge. We talked about all of this a long time ago. I'm neither bragging nor complaining. Everything has already happened. Everything has already happened. The only question is who understood what and how each person understood it. And of course, don't forget, the dominant system, although it's easy for it, it's best for everyone to understand things the way it has explained them to them. I am bringing you back to diarchy, bringing you back to this corporate imperialism, and from that perspective, it is clear to understand that the present is the best of all possible worlds, especially this future one, and from the perspective of infrastructure control. Control over infrastructure, for example, made it possible that for most of those nearly 200 years of governance over that part of the world, a company with about 1,000 employees ruled over hundreds of millions of people. Now, if that's not increased efficiency, though, to be fair, we'll soon achieve even greater efficiency. And it ruled in such a way that they Speaking of territories that, according to numerous records, trace their roots back to several likely extinct civilizations, could not come together for centuries, not knowing what had befallen them or how to get out of it, because infrastructure is too tempting, especially when you forget who built it. Let's not get into that now, because the whole story there actually began after a very interesting event. We're not talking about them over there, just like everything else. You know who we're really talking about. Because, for example, after, or more precisely during, the battle that defined the fate not only of this part of the world, but indirectly of the largest part of the world, which took place in 1757. In the year 1757, at a place called Placé, or to be accurate, using the language of the locals, Palashi. That's a bit further north, about 150 kilometers from what was then Calcutta, or Kalikata, as some call it. Actually, Kalikata is on the other side. A battle took place in which the British, in fact, to be precise, their company, yes, that famous one whose legacy lives on in the United States, defeated the forces of the Bengali ruler, who were 15 times more numerous, with the help of the French as well. Of course, you know how it goes. We started talking about the 17th century. To understand the concept of what was probably the First World War, and although no one calls it that, lately the term has been appearing more and more often, not just here but elsewhere as well. And this decisive victory was ultimately achieved in a very specific and calculated manner, because the various states of Bengal, including their supreme military commander, unexpectedly defected over to the opposing side. This, over the coming several years and then subsequent decades, led to the gradual and very efficient hardening of a significant majority of that specific region of the globe, and the creation, in fact, of a comprehensive colonial infrastructure that bears a very striking resemblance to, if not being entirely identical to, everything that a large part of the world has experienced over the past 1 century or even 2 centuries. And we're not suggesting now, maybe we shouldn't record a special episode about this right now due to increased inefficiency. To a certain extent, as much as it may seem, reading about the history of British rule in India is incredibly beneficial and enlightening for recognizing and understanding many complex things in all of our diverse regions. Not just now, not just in the last 50 and 80 years, at least the last 200 years. I even suggest to anyone interested in dialectics, to literally try to apply all of this as much as they know, and based on whatever opinions they already have about events in our region over the last 200 to 250 years, meaning in real time with what I'm talking about now, to see just how much both the software and the hardware are actually identical. Why isn't he explaining it that way now? Not just now. No one here ever does, actually. I hope the answer is clear. For example, the vast majority, by far the vast majority of those who enabled this rule from over there were actually locals in every segment. From the army, those SPO members, let's cut it short so I don't go into details, who in fact worked for foreigners for a small salary and did what they did, fought against their own people, compatriots, neighbors, and so on, all across the subcontinent, down to the zamindars. Well, that's what's interesting. We'll come back to that somewhere, precisely from that perspective. That is perhaps the best way to describe the emergence of the Kutbash theater, to understand it, as well as many other things, including the question of the so-called intelligentsia and the administrative staff, and how someone can play around precisely by controlling the infrastructure, controlling the flows, and, for example, create whatever they need so that things work out for them, whether during a crisis or when everything is functioning normally. And now, whether 10 or 20 million will die from hunger, or whether in some wars that have nothing to do with you, who knows how many millions will perish, and so on, that is something you yourselves have chosen within your own infrastructure, which we have built for you. And your infrastructure includes the princes we installed for you, the kings we installed for you, the intelligentsia we trained for you, and of course the soldiers, smugglers, criminals, bankers, swindlers, and so on, whom we put in place for you. All of that is our infrastructure. And all of that, precisely, to return to this now late Disneyland, all of that was just finished off by someone else. It is a matter of infrastructure itself, and the key question is, whose is it? Infrastructure, don't forget, is what enables technical and technological progress, and technical and technological progress, in turn, enables the advancement of infrastructure. However, I emphasize once again, if we overlook the key question of whose infrastructure it is and whom it serves, then what happens is, without going back into that forest, exactly what is happening now, clearly. Where most of the world is, they are worried about their own. What will happen? Will it come to that, or have we already entered that digital gulag? Or, for example, will it come to aliens, clearly, Mars? Let's go with that. A note. Maybe I'm wrong. I apologize for mentioning it. A long time ago, I came to the conclusion that most of the infrastructure, or to be precise, all of it, especially the small parts, can be taken away from you, at least from me, but you see how it goes for you. They teach that it's yours, ours, however you want to put it. In reality, it's not really ours, to put it in the most diplomatic and necessary terms. And then from that perspective, from the perspective that, for example, some infrastructure, some systems are not yours, you come to things and to that less important question. And from that perspective, for example, now and then some aliens or Martians show up. So what does it matter? What does it matter that you've come to the conclusion that something isn't yours? Is it from some aliens or from some others, third parties, what does it change? I admit for many people it does change things. I can understand that. However, from the perspective, if you've already come to the point that something isn't yours, and it's not a question of whose it is, no, it's not a question of whose it is. Mars's cells, or rather some others, let's not call out those who are already clearly changing. No, that's not the question. The question is, where is yours? What is the question? Or are you going to wait for it to come from someone else? And precisely for those who are used to having someone else's as their own, of course now they'll bring Mars into the story for them. It fits absolutely perfectly like this, Vaso. It fits into the story. I apologize if you hear some strange noises coming from Vaso's area. I thought the world was about to start moving. Anyway, that's the whole story. Whose infrastructure is it? And who exactly are these local Indian Sepoys who diligently serve the powerful East India Company simply for a regular monthly paycheck? Already, for various needs. Those are the actors we talked about earlier. And that's it, dear.
Ladies and gentlemen.
And now for something completely different.
So, Vasily, the question of infrastructure, where to sleep, where it's nicest for him, he solved it. And it all comes down to the question of infrastructure, which one you choose and how much of it is yours. And for example, let's go over a few important news items so we don't miss anything. For example, since we're on the topic of infrastructure. Very useful. We'll come back to this, I want to thank the colleagues who made it possible to create a quality educational program based on that. You may recall how it's been almost 3 years now, for example, how in Lebanon within Hezbollah, which we've often mentioned, not because of various events that are frequently in the news, but because of their organizational structure and the logic behind their organization. And consider how they suffered so terribly from that sudden attack by the pagers, as it is officially and frequently referred to in the mainstream media. A tragic event that still isn't fully mentioned or explained to this very day. They relied on someone else's infrastructure. That's right. They relied on someone else's infrastructure. And they counted on someone else to build it, right? And even the pagers themselves. And what happened, in short. And now, there is some useful news here that's become clear over the past few months, and you can see what conclusions they've drawn. And yes, the ones that were logical, not just regarding that issue, but those that are logical in general from the perspective of someone who thinks about these things, which isn't particularly interesting right now, is it? Nobody's handing out grants for that. But from the perspective of someone considering how to operate within someone else's infrastructure, someone over there has drawn all the logical conclusions they could. Why they didn't do it earlier, that's for them to figure out. I'm not here to judge, and it's clear that they're applying, that is, that practice. And now they're behaving towards the infrastructure in the way they themselves judge to be necessary, and they also have their own infrastructure. Whatever their infrastructure means, it means a lot of things. Sometimes, if needed, a young guy will get on a donkey and take care of part of the job. What can you do? Not everything can be done via satellite. Or even if it can, it's better this way. And that's the story. Or something from a few days ago. Let's add that he is a student, a scholar. For example, in Afghanistan, our Taliban colleagues have banned, I'm not even sure, there have been various reports. They have officially prohibited and strictly banned government officials, which basically means at every single level of the hierarchy, and I think even everyone, especially all military personnel, whatever and however they are specifically called in their organizational structure, from using modern smartphones, that is, all smartphones and various other smart devices. You have artificial intelligence, smartphones, everything. This best shows how much someone estimates that people are useful and how smart they are. Since everything smart has to be made, various machines, it doesn't matter, it all goes back to that strengthening. It is forbidden. Under very severe penalties. At the very least for them, the least thought out will be cancelled. You know that they are principled. But so that I don't praise and advertise my colleagues now, let me show you our infrastructure. No matter how this sounds to anyone, interestingly, 30 years ago, just to see how much more interesting the world has become in these 30 years. 30 years ago, whatever the Taliban were doing over there, people would talk about it from one end of the world to the other. Now, no one talks about what they're doing, but don't worry, they're still studying, and let them study, just keep studying. Now, since we're on the topic of infrastructure, let me go back a bit. Let me go back a little more. For example, the question of attitude toward infrastructure, whether it's yours or someone else's. For instance, let's stick with India for a bit longer. This is clearly visible, and maybe this is an even better proof of what I was telling you, that, for example, in 1947 and 1948, after that war, in 1945, Disneyland was being prepared, as we discussed, resolving things, and you can see how the issue of Palestinian-Israeli relations was resolved, the resolution of information announcements, and, for example, there is an even clearer picture of the hasty creation of independent states within the former Indian Raj, or Raja, however you want to call it, and how, in fact, it was just a transition from one system to another. And why is it, as we've often discussed, important to understand why some people in the past did not want the unification of nations, especially those who knew and who themselves paid the full price of victory and liberation did not want it. And, for example, let's point out that the People's Republic of China did not want to join at that time, though there are various interpretations. They didn't want to join, others didn't want to accept them, whatever the reason. How long did that last? For about 25 years, let's remember. And when they did join, how did they join? Well, they joined under the conditions they themselves negotiated. And they joined as equal and full-fledged members. Global infrastructures, so that's how they look at it. A lot of rules? I have upheld the concept of the United Nations. Now, whoever wants to talk, let them try to dispute this. From the very start, it defines citizens of the First World, the Second World, and probably various other ranks as well. For example, there are those who are permanent members of the Security Council. There are those who are periodic members. Sometimes they get elected, sometimes they don't. And does anyone explain that as equality, or do they explain why that inequality exists? Because, for example, if someone were to explain, among other things, why that inequality exists, especially up to that point in its creation, and now, as you can see over the course of time, this brings us to what was also perhaps one of the first episodes of Cosmopolitics, to that division into, plant eaters and meat eaters, or as we used to say, carnivores. Why is it that certain nations around the world possess nukes? And is there a fundamental equality between them? For example, are those who have nuclear weapons and those who do not have nuclear weapons both considered to be equally legitimate users of any shared system, various types of global infrastructure, or are they simply not viewed in the same way at all? And by accepting without reservation and adopting as your own a system or infrastructure into which someone has, in various ways, regardless of how it is explained, whether it's said to be good for the planet, the climate, peace, space, the cosmos, placed you as citizens of a second or even a third rank, what do you have to say about that after you realize where you've ended up? Here, precisely these negotiations, whatever is happening there and however this performance, perhaps that's too morbid, on the Middle East, has ended. The best proof is this question I mentioned. The difference between India and China. Why did the Chinese take a different path? Partly by their own will, partly by the will of others. And why did the Indians lose 50 to 60 years? And the question is, where are they now? That is the crucial question. The Cultural Revolution that the Chinese had, no matter how much no one explains why they had it and why it unfolded the way it did, or what the logic behind it was, happened because, unlike China, the industry here never had a cultural revolution. Even though several peoples have moved through here, that's why they will never be like China. Now, to some people, this might not seem like a great success, or even that it's... However, let's leave India and China aside for now. Just look at where you are, where your systems are, and where your infrastructure is. Whatever that means to you, it's a miracle. Or at least, if you don't have a defined sense of we, just look at where you are. It's very simple. It's a question of infrastructure, and those who provide that infrastructure. Let's add something else. This is very important to understand these events now. As I said, now these things need to be looked at. And this, perhaps, is the best confirmation for all those who are still in doubt whether what is happening right now globally, whatever that global means. I don't mean whether Martians will come or not, but generally speaking, in a broader sense, whether it is according to plan or outside of the plan. Let me tell you about a situation from the past, and then you can decide for yourselves, based on that, whether what is happening now is something agreed upon by my neighbors or not. About what I am about to tell you, there is plenty of material and evidence. The only thing is, it's just not popular to discuss it in various interpretations. For example, 20th century and the events of the 20th century, from the First World War onwards, to use them. And the story goes something like this. The British, they really were, and during that period, for example, while they controlled, along with many other things we've mentioned here, and, for example, when in 1860, the unification of Germany finally happened, as it did, and without going into detail about to what extent and who was left out of it, what that meant in the 20th century, for various performances in the 20th century. I apologize, this really might sound rather morbid, but that's how it is. And especially after that Berlin Congress and the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Congress, just to remind you, is when they agreed on how to carve up the Balkans, and the conference is the one about Africa. We were always involved in that, don't worry, as you can see. It's nothing new. The British Empire had already clearly seen that a powerful new political force was steadily emerging on the continent, which, thanks to its decisive military victory over the forces of France and Napoleon, could now fundamentally disrupt the established balance of power. So now what should be done? Predominantly, it's about containing or appeasing Germany before the Second World War, as it's explained. But don't worry, someone over there is thinking about it. And over there, people will think someone is thinking in advance always, not just once or twice, and preparing the infrastructure. And in preparation for that, already by 1880, they had started developing what we're talking about now, so at least 30 years, if not more, before the First World War. That actually letting them over there, not just letting them develop on their own, but helping them to develop, even give them credit, and give them access to the entire global infrastructure, which at that moment you control. That's the point. Teach them to use it as much as you can. This led to that it happened very quickly. By using numerous resources, and let's not forget coal either, but let's leave that aside for now. We won't look at it purely from the perspective of energy and energy carriers. Germany, you can see how in that moment, in a very short time, became a dominant industrial power. That steel production at the end of the 19th century in Germany was greater than the total steel production in Great Britain, which ruled over half the world directly. Just look at how much and how directly, as well as in Russia and the United States. It was only the development of the United States in the following years and decades that reversed this, and in numerous other parameters as well. Even when you look at participation in international trade, that Germany at the end of the 19th, in the beginning of the 20th century. But how did this avant-garde come to a halt? It was almost at the same level, if not even higher in percentage terms, if you look at it, because here we come to a very interesting point. What was recorded as international trade at that time? Since most of the world was part of some countries, what exactly counted as international trade? So the question of data is very questionable. But if we look at what was recorded as international trade, I think that only in recent years have the Chinese reached the percentage share that Germany had at the beginning of the 20th century. And by many other parameters, that's what everyone agrees on. What came after that painter was nothing compared to the administration. That was real power. However, to see how nothing there happened by chance, you just keep bringing them in. Let them use our infrastructure, our monetary systems. The communication system, which was also controlled by Britain and many other things. This is basically the whole story of the First World War. From the British side, it was prepared very intelligently. Let them do this, that, and that. When the time comes, we will turn off those taps, and then this and that will happen. And it was crystal clear, since the war lasted longer than a couple of months, and that war was planned to last, not like this one that our colleague Donald started for 2 or 3 days, but a few months. It was clear how it would all end. Of course, how many people would suffer there, in which territories, and in what way, and that is now, unfortunately, I apologize, especially from the perspective of our region. You know how tragically all of that turned out, and also how much someone got used to treating someone else's infrastructure as if it were their own. This can easily be followed, what I'm talking about now, and it became clear, especially as the war entered its second year, it became obvious. Let me mention, most of what the British had prepared to contain Germany, especially as the war dragged on, they didn't even implement during the first few years, so as not to upset the United States. That's why things escalated in 1917. The United States entered the war. Of course, there were numerous other factors. Exhaustion on all sides, and naturally, a huge power with a massive army was arriving. However, essentially, that's precisely why the war ended so quickly. Because at that point, everyone pushed all the weaknesses they could to the limit. There are many details here, but for the sake of efficiency in this episode, of course, as it usually happens, someone over there drew their own conclusions from all of this, and then some 20-something years later made the same mistake, and the same error, and ended up the same way. Which is completely logical. If you're going to think about it this way, in my opinion, that's just how it was. And now, what is logical from the perspective of today and the present moment? I hope that's not too difficult to start with. Of course, you know how it goes already. In the best of all possible worlds, whichever one, in the late one, in the future one, yes, it's always easiest for someone else. Were there aliens there too? From the perspective of someone trying to convince you that someone from the same river will create the best of all possible worlds, is that progress or not? You decide for yourself. You'll remember that we talked about these fascinating nations, how you from Indonesia not only didn't want to go there. As Sukarno used to say, let me check how many of you noticed us. I won't quote him now, but you can feel the hope. Because of that, Allah can still be useful. As they used to say, back then someone from outside, they called him the white man, would come here to tell us what to do, and now we have to go over there to him so he can tell us what to do. And now with technological advancement, now we want to be there, somewhere in the wallet, on the computer, on the phone, on the watch. Maybe they'll even implant it in your head. If they could plant the secret police and similar structures among people before, why wouldn't they now throw in some chips as well? Maybe it'll be cheaper, maybe it'll be more humane. And the important thing is that there's always someone to tell you what to do and how to use the infrastructure. Of course, it will be easier and cheaper than having your own. And that's really the whole story. What story? The whole story about those who are sovereign and those who are not sovereign. However it may sound, they'll come up with some nice name for it again. They'll come up with another nice name for those who aren't sovereign. They won't call them slaves, serfs, commoners, or citizens. They'll find some nice name. They'll find some nice name. But no matter what name they come up with, God forbid, don't let yourselves be deceived. There is only one name, and that is freedom. And that is a question of jurisdiction and a question of ownership. Over the system, over systems and infrastructure. In short, do you have your own infrastructure? Are you building your own infrastructure? How are you building it? What is your relationship with the broader or global infrastructure? There were protective mechanisms, there was autonomy, there were alternatives, no matter which systems or which infrastructure you were thinking about. We have thought about some and about others as well, and we have worked and will continue to work on them. And that, in fact, let me remind you, is the whole concept of this gathering. Look, even Vasa is impatient and is going off to develop his own systems. So we are moving forward, and whoever wants to join us can come along. Bon voyage. As for everyone else, that wagon, don't worry, it's moving on. And that's how it should be. Now you tell me that all of this isn't good. For the better. What more could you want?